Good morning. It's Web Wednesdays, and we are going to be covering some Node, which I'm super stoked about because I feel like everyone should know some Node.
Yeah, Node is amazing. It's an amazing tool.
A little bit more Node in your life is never a bad thing. I'm Stacey Mulcahy. I'm a technical evangelist. Feel free to cue a little laughter in the background there. I wish we had a laugh track. I think I need one of those. I'm from New York, and so there you go. and today I am with
Rami Sayar from Montreal.
Oh, Canadian jokes.
Yeah, Canadian. It's Montreal's in that French province. It's you can get your own stereotypes, but
yeah, but the whole thing is that we have two Canadians teaching you Node. I'm just displaced. I got the Brooklyn attitude by proxy from living there for a bit. So today we're going to talk about building apps with Node.js, and we're going to cover a bunch of things, in terms of working with Node for you. And I'm really excited. We're going to go right from the building blocks into creating kind of like a chat application. So we're going to cover front end, we're going to do some back end, we're going to cover some Azure, Node, Express, all those kind of keywords that you hear. And we're going to be just pretty much delving right into it. So we're going to go over a couple of things about just Node, and we'll do a little bit of housekeeping. And the next thing you know, we're going to be right into the code and right into the demos. So This is me, Stacey Mulcahy, technical evangelist, like I said, out of New York. I focus mostly on HTML5, JavaScript, IoT, sometimes design and UX. Interview designers and developers. You can see some of the stuff I do on Channel 9. I talk a lot about marketing, and I have a whole new IoT series on Channel 9.
My name is Rami. I focus on the web, HTML5, JavaScript, Node, IE11, and I'm based out of Montreal, so I spend most of my time helping startups and developers over there. I sit in the Notman House, so if you're ever in town and you want to check out the really cool startup hub, definitely come to the Notman House. I'm writing a little book on startup culture, seeing as I'm always among them, and I used to work at a startup, and I love startup culture, so if you're interested, make sure you follow it on Twitter. And I blog on Canadian devs, very Canadian-oriented blog, but we've got some great technical content if you're ever interested in Node or IE or anything.
I like how you qualified that. Very Canadian, but there's technical content. Don't worry, we can handle it. It's so good. Also, instead of the web, it's got to be the interwebs. From now on, it's just the interwebs today. So a couple of things that we're going to cover today with the Node.js. We're going to go through, and just so you have a sense of the structure of how we're going to follow through on this, we're going to do introduction to Node.js. We're going to do an introduction to the Express framework. And so we're going to explain a lot of the things step by step so you have a really good fundamental understanding and you can kind of just take it further from there. Then, kind of closing off this morning, it might be afternoon for some of you or even evening, but closing off this big section, we'll be doing building a backend with Socket.io and Mongo. And so we're going to show you a little bit about how you work with Mongo, the beauty of Socket.io. I say the beauty because once you kind of know it, it's one of those things you just want to use for everything. Creating a user interface, connecting the front end and back end, and then debugging and deploying on Azure. And so, it'll take you from the ground up all the way to putting that out for the world to see. So just to set a couple of expectations for our session. Target audience. I don't know what you think, but I'm thinking web developers, web designers. If you have any kind of experience in another kind of server-side language, maybe it's PHP, maybe it's ASP, maybe Python, Ruby, any of those kind of things, Node would be of interest to you. Yeah. If you're an IoT person, Node is definitely of interest to you. We have some suggested prerequisites and supporting material, so you can take a look at those links that are listed there. Once again, there's some books, there's software, all that kind of thing just put into one place for you. So feel free to, grab some of the, grab any of those materials and use them for further reference. And again, you can get 50 MVA points for this event. So we have the code that's down there. It's kind of shortened for building apps Node.js, and that expires, November 14th. So, use that code, get an extra 50 MVA points. and keep learning with the Web Wednesdays. We've got a couple things that are coming up. Next week is going to be mobile apps. The following week we have, I think it's going to be an intro to jQuery, which looks really awesome. And even a couple weeks ago we had, an intro to Bootstrap. So let's just get started. Let's just dive right in. Instead of talking about stuff, we're just going to get right in there. So introduction to Node.js. We're going to talk about, okay, what is Node? What do you need to know about it? Where is it used? Who uses it? Why should you use it? Why should you consider it? Kind of give you that little rationale that you need to get you onto that path of learning it. We're going to talk about setting up your environment, and this is going to be coming from a Windows perspective. Once again, just very quickly, some of the things that you need to do to set up your environment. Now, to give you an idea about setting up your environment, we did that just yesterday from scratch, so we can give some good advice on that. Your first Node application, just, it's like your Hello World example, and then we're just going to kind of level it up. And then we're going to talk about the Node package manager and just the idea of what it is, how you use it, and how that becomes part of your tool set when you're working with Node. We have a GitHub repo. We've put all the slides there. We put all of our demo code there. So anything that you need in terms of what we're going to be covering, you can go to this link. You can just download it, clone, whatever you want to do, and you can either follow along or you can get a sense of what those demos are for further reference. All right, if I feel like I'm rushing, it might be all the coffee in my veins, or it might be I just want to get to the code. So we're going to talk about Node. What is Node? If you had to explain it to someone, how would you explain it?
Node is a way for making web applications using JavaScript. That is the simplest way that I could explain it. It's really about it's this tool set, these libraries that all come together so that if you're familiar with either JavaScript or some other server-side language, you can pick it up and build web applications that are real-time, that work extremely well with the new latest technologies like WebSockets, and that are generally really high-performant.
So for kind of like an average JavaScript developer who's mostly probably doing front-end stuff, let's say, maybe they're familiar with jQuery or they're familiar with some of those libraries, suddenly now they can now put a whole nother kind of set of technologies in their tool set because they can leverage what they already know.
Yeah, if you guys already know JavaScript, then it's great because with JavaScript you can build the back end to your front end. And what's really cool as well is that you can also share some of this code. So if you've built these data models for your front end, you can literally copy the code onto your back end and use the same code and have one code base for that type of stuff. We talked a little bit about leveraging your current skills in terms of JavaScript now on the server side. And, if you haven't done any server-side work and you do have JavaScript knowledge, this is a huge, huge bonus for you. Because suddenly now you can start writing all this stuff on the server side, image resizing, aggregating, social feeds, all that kind of stuff. And it's right there for you to do. And it's very, very approachable. Some other things, I guess, to know about Node that we've kind of mentioned previously or whatnot, still in beta phase, right? Yeah, it's still in beta phase, but it's actually being used in production across a whole variety of different companies. So it's definitely stable. I believe the reason why it's still in beta phase was simply because they still like to make some changes to the framework. But for the most part, it is very stable, very performant. Lots of companies are using it. We'll show some examples a little later. And what's really cool is that it's all open source, and it was created in 2009, not too long ago. And since then, the community around Node...
2009. That's about 5 years, right?
Yeah, and in 5 years...
Math is hard without caffeine.
Yeah.
But 5 years.
5 years. But the community has exploded in those 5 years. It's just huge. If you look at any other language, there's very few of them that have grown as fast as Node.
Yeah. If you go to GitHub, period, the number one in terms of just languages in repositories is JavaScript, whether or not it's Node related, like server or front end, it doesn't matter. It's JavaScript. So you can definitely see that trend is just continuing, right?
Yeah.
So when to kind of use Node, that's always one of those questions of when do I use what technology? And so, Node has some really great applications.
Yeah, among them chat applications, which we're going to show you how to make one today. You can build real-time applications, anything that requires a collaborative environment. So let's think of document editing in the cloud, where you have multiple people working on the same document together. And that requires some real-time communication with the server. So if you need to do that, Node.js is a great tool for that, especially the way that it's designed with the event loop that we'll cover. And it's really a fantastic framework for building these type of real-time collaborative applications. You can use it for game servers. So if you need some fast, high-performant game server in the backend, something that needs to handle thousands of players at a time, it's definitely a great framework for that. If you're building ad servers, you need to handle thousands of requests a second. Another great example for Node. And as well, streaming servers. It's got some really cool tools that will help you stream between different sockets that you're data that you're getting through different sockets. And it's a fantastic tool for that.
Yeah, and those are some of those like more kind of complex, scenarios that we're talking about where, real-time communication is an issue. But, no, it's not just for real-time communication. You could just, instead of running your basic site in PHP, you could just replace it with Node, any of those kind of things.
Yeah.
So it's a nice, you can use it in a variety of ways, and it definitely excels at a lot of these kind of real-time applications that we kind of discussed.
Yeah. You can use it to build the backend for your front-end app. If you're building a single-page application, Node is a great way to do that. If you're a JavaScript developer and you just simply want to create an API for your application in the backend and you don't want to learn a new language, you can definitely use Node for that. It's not just for real-time applications. You can use it for any web-related project. I guess I'd like to ask you, so when maybe Node is not the best tool for the job? Because it seems like the way we've described it, it's like the best tool for everything. But there's a few moments where it's not necessarily the best tool.
What would you say? Like, what would be some kind of like warning signs where you're like, maybe Node's not where we should be going?
So the Node is structured to be single-threaded, and there's an event loop that runs. So if you're ever building an application that requires you to do some very long-running calculations in the back end, Node might not be the best tool for that, simply because you will be blocking all the other events that are going to come in. So if you started doing this calculation, the server won't be able to handle any other requests that it gets in the meantime. So for situations where you need to run long-running operations, Node might not be the best tool, but it's great for writing JavaScript code everywhere. It's one of the best tools for that.
So we talked a little bit about like, okay, what is Node? Why you should or shouldn't use it. And when it's one of those things that every time a technology comes out, I say, okay, give me some examples of it in the wild. Like, show me where Node is being used so that I can actually say to my boss or justify to someone else, yes, we should be using this. So we've got some examples listed here. Right.
Microsoft is a big example. We use Node to power Azure mobile services. If you actually are interested in Azure mobile services and you're looking for a backend for your mobile app, you can write that backend in Node. Literally just take your Node scripts and put them on Azure and you're good to go. That's one of the examples. But you've also got companies like Cloud9, the New York Times, and a few other ones as well.
Yeah, that's one of the beauties about learning a little bit of JavaScript is you start to see it being implemented in different places where you didn't expect it. And mobile services was one of them. I was like, oh, hey, I can just go and kind of configure what I want returned back from this, and I can just write in JavaScript. I don't have to learn something else. So for me, that was like I don't know, it was one of those shining moments where I was like, yes, thank you. And you're starting to see that across the board. More people are starting to use it. JavaScript's being used in very different ways, whether it's on the web, whether it's being used, to create, even native applications, however it's being used. Yeah.
Speaking of native applications, what's really cool is that you can actually use the Azure mobile services with HTML5 apps and with PhoneGap as well. And then you can share the same code that you have in your mobile app with your backend as well. And that's just for the JavaScript developer, you're empowered to do everything that you want with that language. It's like, I've seen and heard of you talk about IoT as well. And that's something that is coming up. JavaScript and the Internet of Things.
Yeah, we're not gonna put it any other way. It's a little pervasive. It's everywhere. And you've got some people who are just not a fan of it. Maybe it's dynamic. I like to say it's like Play-Doh. You can kind of like mold it into whatever you want it to be because it's so dynamic. You can just add things, and there's so many different ways and formats and structures that you can actually code JavaScript. So some people who like more strict typing, that kind of thing, not the biggest fan. But that's why something like TypeScript, for example, is really good for those people who come from more strict typing, object-oriented languages. Yep. They still have that entry point. So it's one of those things where it's there and it's here to stay, I think, for a while. Yeah. So Node in the wild, our backend in terms of mobile services is a great example. The one really great thing about Node, and we were talking about open source and the rest of it, the community is out of control, right?
It's huge.
Yeah.
It's huge. It's the Node itself is the third most popular project on GitHub.
Okay, wait, do you know what the first two most popular projects are? If you listed that, I got to ask you.
Okay, well, I believe the first one is Bootstrap.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, yeah. I just don't know what the second one is. Unfortunately,
I can't even guess, but we'll figure that out. Third most popular project, huge. Yeah.
Over 2 million downloads per month, over 20 million downloads of the last version, the one that we're suggesting you download for this MVA, and the really cool thing, the thing that I like the most about Node is just how much code is already written for you, so that you can just pull together.
Yeah.
NPM, the Node package manager, it's the central repository where all of these extensions, these third-party libraries that you can use. And there's 81,000 modules on NPM.
It's like
over 81,000.
There's like a module for everything.
Pretty much.
Like if you ever think that you need some functionality, don't spend the time like trying to learn and write something from scratch. Always just search, because you'll be really shocked. Like the other day I was doing that. I was like, I really want to know if there's something that's that can handle, I wanted to do like, not just like basic email, but I wanted to do like the whole kind of crazy inbox stuff. And, is there a library for that? Yeah, sure enough, there's like a library for SMTP, like all those kind of things. So you'd be really surprised. And they're usually well documented and they're usually maintained, which is, one of those big things. Like it's great to use a module or, a library from someone, but you never know about if it's being maintained or if it's active. And Node seems to feel like the community is really just always active.
Yeah, and if you want to double check if a module is maintained, you could just go to NPM, the website, search that module name, and you can get all these stats about it, how many times it's been uploaded, and all of this information will help you make a good decision on whether this module is the best one.
Yeah, and
for you.
I mean, the other thing too about the community is that there's tons of meetups all over the place. And I mean, I don't know how many of you people out there, use Meetup. I kind of live by it, and it's a really good way to learn new technologies or meet people in different areas. And so for me, I actually, I don't know about you, but I attend a lot of meetups, and I host one in the New York office on Node.js, which I thought they're like, Node.js and Microsoft, this is weird. And I was like, we love Node. And I actually did a whole session on where Node is. And everyone was like, I get it. I totally get it. So it's one of those kind of defining moments where I was like, yes, I've got Node.js meetup in the office. They're going through all these kind of projects, explaining their code, how they built stuff, problems that they had. Best resource. I mean, you can search online, but going in person and just listening to people talk about their process and their projects, one of the best resources.
I definitely have to agree with that. There's lots of meetups in Montreal as well. HTML5 MTL, if you're in Montreal right now, definitely go to sign up for that meetup. You'll get to meet some Node developers there.
Yeah, the one person from Montreal.
The one person. I don't know how people are from Montreal, so if you're from Montreal, write in the chat room because I want to know. Hopefully you guys are here tonight.
Yeah, you better represent. So we're going to just get kind of right in now that we've talked a little bit about Node, and we're going to talk about setting up your environment. And setting up your environment, this is something that we did literally from scratch yesterday. It was, I think, from start to end. By the time you kind of first of all, starting up your environment, no matter what language you're going with, you always have that kind of set up
Yeah, there's a little
time.
speed bump when you get started. And it took us about 40 minutes to do it from scratch on really
I think it was
machines, but
40
maybe
minutes,
even less
and
than
we
that.
tested everything.
Yeah.
We tested all of our demos. So
Yeah.
I think to actually get set up was probably about a half an hour.
Yeah.
And so, just be aware, setting up your environment. Number one thing here is read the directions, don't skip the steps. And so I always tend to do that. I'm always like, whatever, and that's how I type too, just like that, just so you know. But I always, end up like trying to set up my environment. I skip a step, and the next thing I know, I got to go back and start over from scratch. So, we're going to talk a little bit about just setting up your environment. We're not going to walk through the process necessarily of setting up your environment here. We don't have enough time to go through that, but we have all this stuff kind of documented. So, installing Node on Windows.
Yeah, so the first thing that you want to do is actually get Node. And the place where you need to go is nodejs.org. For Windows, you've got two choices. You can use the 64-bit one or the 32-bit one, depending on which version of those is installed on your computer. And there's a simple installer. You just follow the wizard, and you're good to go. And if you're interested in building it yourself, there's a few links that you can check out as well.
You're a little crazy that way.
Yeah, like some people actually want to do that. They want to try some of the more experimental things.
Yeah.
And definitely, like, if you want to do it yourself, you can. You can compile it for Windows and any of the other operating systems that you're using. One tool that I really like a lot is Chocolatey. And it's this really simple package manager for Windows. So if you're interested in using that to manage most of your developer tools and your installations, it's quite simple. You can go find it online and then just run a very simple command, choco install node.js.install, and it will run the installer for you.
So one thing when you kind of go and you download this and you install, there's a couple things that you need to do after the fact. And one of them is going to be setting your path variable. And you want to be able to do that so that you can just basically open up a command prompt, type Node, and it just automatically knows where to reference where you've downloaded Node, right?
So the installer should do that, but it's always good to double check, just that way you're not, when you're trying to run Node, you run into issues where it can't find Node. And why don't I show you how to do that, how to double check to see if...
Sure.
In your path variable. And if not, you can check out, if you want to check it out later, you can check out this YouTube video as well. But what we'll do is we'll switch over to my screen. And a very simple way to do it on Windows 8.1 is basically to open up the File Explorer. So here I am in a File Explorer. I've got my Node project from GitHub, if in case you haven't downloaded it. And I'm going to right-click on this PC and open in new window. And then what's that going to give me is basically this PC. And one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Computer tab and go to System Properties, which is going to open the System Control Panel. There's other ways to get to this Control Panel. You can just type in Control Panel into the Start menu, but this is the way that I like to do it. It's the way that I'm used to doing it. But of course, there's different ways. And what you'll want to do is you'll want to go to Advanced System Settings. In there, you'll get this dialog box that pops up. The next step, and the last one, is literally you just click on Environment Variables. When you do that, you've got all the environment variables set for your machine. One of the things that you should double check is the path variable. Now, there's two places where that could be. It could be up in the user variables or in the system variables, depending on your settings. And what you'll want to check is press Edit. If you press Edit, you'll notice you get this really long, this little window with the variable name and the variable path. If you'll notice, Node is correctly included in the path variable value. You can see it right there. I'll stop the highlighting.
That's always my favorite. It's like that long string in a window you got to scroll.
You got to separate it with semicolons, but if it's in there, the minute you open up any command prompt on your system, you should be able to get Node just by typing in Node. The other thing you got to remember is if you've got any command prompts that are already open, you got to restart them.
Yeah, I always forget that personally. I'm always like, why does this not work? And the other thing I think just to quickly note too is that once you kind of go through the install instructions, is that sometimes you'll get like an error, and it's kind of like I don't know if it's like an end of file error or what it is, but it shows up when you're trying to basically update NPM, which is the Node Package Manager. We'll get into that. And sometimes they'll say, you get this random error, and it'll point to a directory. And it's basically just telling you, hey, that directory doesn't exist and it needs to exist. So you just need to go in and create those folders. And once again, this whole process is pretty well documented. I think we have it in our resources. So you can go ahead and kind of just go through that process and make sure that everything's running and installed. So we're going to kind of just kick right into, your very first Node application. We're going to assume that everything's installed and it's good and it's golden. And we're going to talk about, just running your very first Node application. And so we're going to have a demo here, and it's just going to be a basic Hello World application. I mean, I think that's a standard. I think we're required to do that.
Yep.
I don't think we can, go past and collect 200 unless we do this kind of like basic Hello World application. So why don't we go ahead and
awesome.
walk through that?
All right, so if you've already cloned the GitHub repo, you can open up this project and follow through with me as well. So once you've got that open, you can go to the Hello World project. You'll find a file named app.js. If you open up this file, this is the code base that I'm showing you. Console.log hello world. If you're coming from a JavaScript front-end background, you'll recognize this. This is literally the only thing that you need to do to get hello world running. Now, let me show you what it looks like. Here I've opened up my command prompt. Hopefully everything is visible. I'm going to go into that directory, and I'm going to type in node app.js. And there we have it. Hello world.
Yeah.
That was fast. One line of code. This is just awesome. I love it when it's just that simple.
It's one of those things like the Hello World application. It's always like that moment where you're like, yes, it's my first time. I've done it. It's awesome. And then it's always like, that feeling afterwards. You're like, that's all it was. Yeah. But simple kind of just getting you used to the idea of running that. And once again, even to kind of go through, we're just console log hello world, but we opened up the console, typed in Node, and then you pointed to the file. And I think that's a really important thing. We'll show a little bit maybe in the next demo, but it's important to know that that's how you kind of get Node started. That's how you're running it. If you're used to doing anything in other languages, whether it's be Python or PHP, like with the CLI, that kind of thing, where you're just running something off the command line, then it's very, very similar, right? So hello world, you've gotten the first step. So now we're going to just show you one of the more common uses of Node, which is running your server, right?
That's right. So we're going to get back to the demo here, and what we're going to do is we're going to open up the second project, 02 Hello World HTTP. And if you open app.js, you've got something that's a little bit more full. There's more lines of code. There's more stuff going on.
But less white space.
Less white space. Yes, more text on the screen. All right, cool. But it's very straightforward as well. So let's go through it line by line.
Yeah.
And the first thing that you'll notice is you've got this variable HTTP calling this require function. Now we'll get to require a little bit later. It's part of the module loading system. But the next thing that I want to point out too is this variable HTTP contains a function called create server. And what we're going to do next is literally call HTTP create server and pass it a function to handle any requests that it gets and to write the responses as well. That's all you need to do to create an HTTP server. One function call and you've got it. Now, what are we doing with the callback that we've handed to create server? This is a callback, this function right here. What you're going to notice is we're going to use the response variable that's passed into the callback. We're going to write the head, say 200, it's okay, it's good. Pass it the content type. I'm going to say text plain because it's not going to be HTML. It's just going to literally be hello world. And we're going to end that response with hello world. Now this function will return a object that we're going to put in our server variable. Mm-hmm. And this object is going to have another function called listen. And the minute that we call listen, that's when our server is going to start running.
Okay.
And we're going to listen to this port.
Okay. So in terms of, a couple of questions just to walk through this when we go through, the server.listen, you have 7,000 here. So if I was to go into the browser and let's say this was running, that would be the port number I'd be looking for, right?
That's right.
By default, what is a port number? If you don't do you need to specify something? Is there something by default?
So ideally, you should be specifying the port that you're running on. Now, if you don't specify one, I believe the default is 80, and that's the port that your browser uses, the default HTTP port. But on some machines, you can't actually run things unless you're in the administrator mode.
Yep.
So we like to use a sort of port that we use for debugging purposes. So in my case, I chose 7000. It's completely arbitrary.
Yeah.
Now, of course, if you search online, you'll find a list of commonly used ports and which application they're tied to.
Yeah.
But the one that I'm using is 7000. I think the minute you cross over the 1000 numbers, it's pretty much free.
Pretty open.
Do whatever you want with
Yeah,
it.
I do 8888 all the time. I don't know why. It's just what I do.
And actually, you'll notice that a few of these demos will have different ports as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Way to screw everyone up. I'm going to give you a different port now.
All right. So before in the command prompt, I was in the hello world directory. I typed in cd .. to get out of that directory and back to the parent directory. And then from there, I'm going to go into my 02 hello world folder. What you'll notice if I run directory, I've got the same setup, node, and then there's this file called app.js. I'm going to run it. Here we are. Something's running because our command prompt at the top is showing the currently running command, so it's still running. And I'm just going to pop over to the browser, type in http localhost 7000. It's going to run.
Yeah.
There we go. Hello world.
All right. So we've
Through the browser.
So we've got the whole kind of, now we can start building web pages.
That's right.
Right.
And even if you just want to create a simple API, we'll show you how to do that with Express a little later. This is all you need, really. It's a few lines of code, and you've got an HTTP server. I'll show you one last thing, just to prove to you that this was sent with the right content type. I went into my F12 tools here, went into the network tab, press play to start capturing network traffic. If I refresh, there you'll see it. That's my type. I'm going to control 1 so you can see it a little more clearer. Text/plain.
Perfect. That was fairly quick to get up and running with that kind of thing.
Yeah, not a lot of lines of code to get an HTTP server running.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, hello world, basic, server going. We're going to talk about a couple more, I would say, fundamental, but also maybe a little bit more complex concepts with Node that are just important to note as we start getting into some of the more advanced things that we're going to start to do, right? So we have like event-driven programming.
So what is event-driven programming?
I don't know. What is it?
What is it?
Tell me.
Awesome. Basically, it's a different way of thinking about your program flow. Normally, in sort of the more imperative style programming languages, things tend to follow, the lines of code tend to follow each other, and it's a little bit more linear in terms of flow.
Right.
With event-driven programming, it's a little bit different. So basically, the flow of your program is defined by the events that are taking place. So if you're building a network application, if you're building a GUI application, typically there's an event, like say a control click, a mouse press, network I/O, something that came in, a request that came in. Those are all, drawing. Those are all events. And the way that you structure your programming in event-driven programming is by handling specific events as they arrive. So the flow is no longer linear; it's more split up.
Sure.
And you just wait for an event to actually take place for a specific code callback function to execute.
So I could be resizing the browser, and I could have made a call to a service that was going to give me all my Twitter API, feedback, and that might come while I'm also doing this. So it's also handling what I'm doing here, but also another event that might have happened at the same time, for example, right?
And there's a loop that takes control of which event takes, which callback is called next.
Right.
Now, if you'll notice in our HTTP server, if I go back to that, this is an example of event-driven programming. You've got this function, create server, and I'm giving it a callback, right? And you'll notice request response. The minute that we get an HTTP request, that's when this function is going to get executed. That's the event-driven programming part of this server.
Right, because it's not necessarily a synchronous option. It's not like something just happens automatically. It's like there's a process that happens, and you've got to wait for that.
Exactly.
Right? So another kind of concept that, to cover that I think is fairly important is the node event loop.
That's right. So we're talking about all of these different events that are taking place. Well, how do we know what event's going to get executed? How do we trust that this callback will actually get executed, right? Because it seems like there's nothing to guarantee that in our code. Well, the way that happens is that Node provides you with an event loop as part of the language. So the minute that you call Node, you don't need to call a start function to start this loop that's waiting for events. You literally just put in your script, your code, and the loop starts the minute that you start Node. And it doesn't end until the last callback is called. So what that means is that if you started and created an HTTP server, okay, the end of that callback will just never arrive because you're always going to be waiting for HTTP requests to come in. And as a result, your program won't shut down until you tell it to shut down. Now, one thing to note about this event loop, if you're coming from other languages, the event loop is run under a single thread. So if you ever call a function like sleep, for example, which normally pauses the process, you're going to pause everything else as well. The event loop will simply just stop executing any other event. So anything else that comes in, it'll just have to be put on the back burner.
I think a lot of people are kind of familiar with that just in terms of JavaScript in general, how that works and how they capture things constantly and things like that. So we've got another big one that's important, and I think you already kind of mentioned this previously a little bit, was the whole idea of blocking, right? What happens with that?
That's right. So if you call sleep, for example, you're blocking the event loop, right?
Right.
Now, of course, there are other operations that you could do that might also block the event loop as well. Things like reading a file.
Right.
Now, what you'll see on the screen is this blocking I/O, and I'm basically getting the file system module, and I'm trying to read a file. But I'm reading it synchronously. So what's going to happen is the event loop is going to be blocked until the whole file is read. Now, this might not be very optimal, because if you think about it, sometimes files are going to be 100 megabytes.
Really, really big.
Like really big. So
why?
If you're running this HTTP server and you're getting all of these requests, and all of a sudden you need to read a file, and that file is really big, you're going to stop all the other requests from being handled.
Yep.
And it's just not going to, it's basically going to freeze your server.
Yep.
So
it basically locks out your user.
It locks out your user. So
it's just it's non-responsive until it's done.
There's a common thing that users experience called when the application freezes, and that's pretty much what it means. Like there's some long-running operation in the background that's stopping your ability to click on things.
I'm always like, I feel like when that happens, if I just mash the keyboard as fast as I can, it's gonna just make it go quicker. It's going to make it work again.
But the thing is, you're probably making it worse because you're creating all of these events that now it has to process.
Oh, I totally am.
It's just like...
Yeah. The problem's the user. I know that. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of those things to consider is when you're doing those processes, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous, is that you have to be really, really, concerned about that and what you're doing to the experience in general.
Especially if you're using Node, there's an event loop that's built in, so you don't want to run anything that's synchronous. You want to have all your operations be as async as possible. And even things like reading from a file, you can run asynchronously. Yeah. Just to show you an example, if we just pop back to the Visual Studio screen, you'll see here's my example of reading a file synchronously. When this code executes, the entire file content will be in this variable. I'm going to output it afterwards. Now, if I want to read that same file in a way that's asynchronous, all you notice is the function call is going to be different. Function name is different. I'm still going to pass it the file that I want to read, but here I'm passing a callback. And what that's going to do is, it's the minute it reads a chunk of that file, it's going to execute that callback and then move on and let other events run. Right. And it won't just freeze until the whole file is written. It'll read it in little buckets, little buffers. And that's one way that you can avoid freezing your event loop. Yeah, like back in the day where you used to go and read a file and you'd read line by line. Right, because at least you could read the line, use that line if you need to display something, read the line again, that kind of thing. So that's basically kind of what it's doing, just chunks of information. Chunks of information. And in event-driven programming, your objective is really to get the program flow tied as closely as possible to the actual data flow. So if you're getting small chunks of data, ideally your callback should be dealing with that specific chunk of data as they arrive.
And you've mentioned callbacks a lot. Callback, 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 callback. You know, basically a function that handles, or something that you want to be, you know, called when something's returned, right? So we got the whole idea of callback style programming.
Exactly. So you've got the event loop, and the minute any event occurs, ideally you want to execute something to handle what that event means. So that's what callback style programming is. Now, you can imagine when you're running a server application or just any application in general, there's going to be different types of events, maybe hundreds of events, depending on the application. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a lot of different callbacks. Now, this could actually end up with something that I'd like to term callback insanity. And let's just show you an example.
Yeah, if your eyes hurt when you look at this, our eyes hurt as well. We feel your pain.
Yeah. So in this example, what we've got is we got the file system again. We're trying to read a directory. And then for each file, we're going to check to see if there was an error that happened. If there is an error, continue.
Yeah.
For each file, we're going to read something. And then it just keeps going on and on and on till at the end, we're trying to actually accomplish something, which is just resize all of the images in this directory and then save them somewhere else. But this is what it might look like.
Yeah, just nested all the way down. It's like a big arrow. You know,
Yeah.
It ends up being like, keep going, keep going, keep going, oh, more, all the way back. And, you know, in some ways, like you look at that and you're like, okay, at least I know that this is happening, then this is happening, and then this is happening, but it's not readable. It's definitely not manageable. And it's really, really hard to debug because you're just following this crazy kind of, I like to call it the arrow, but it's just like, oh, here I go. I'm going to insanity and then all the way back, right?
Yeah, it's not manageable at all. But there are ways to handle callback insanity. And one of those ways is using promises style programming.
Yep.
All right. And basically what it is a promise is basically a function that will return a promise.
You will return a promise?
Sorry, yeah, that was very circular. let me try again.
I'll be right back. I got coding to do. I need some promises.
Exactly. Promise style programming, it's basically when a function will return a promise object that will return something in the future.
Right.
So it's promising that it will do something for you.
Yeah, I still need this. I need a lot of this. And it's the idea of like, you know, returning something to you, and you can figure out when it's done, you can figure out if there's an error, you can figure out if there's success, and you handle it, you know, when you need to handle it and what it should do, and you handle those callbacks. So promises are actually, I mean, I think one of the first times I saw promises was like in the jQuery framework, and I was like, oh, what's this? You know, and you start to realize, oh yeah, it's used throughout, and so it's a very common kind of concept that I think a lot of people have kind of taken to.
Yeah.
You can chain promises together too. So if it returns something, you know, you can have something else return another promise and chain them. That whole kind of beauty of JavaScript thing that's going on. But promises can kind of help you simplify a little bit of that, right?
That's right.
So we're going to go into another demo, and I think just based on that idea, and it's going to be a basic TCP demo, right?
Yeah, so what I'm going to show you is, if you open up Project 5, it's this classic server. Looks fairly similar to the HTTP server that we created, but in this case, what I'm doing is I'm using TCP instead, so I'm requiring net as opposed to HTTP, but I'm still going to return the same thing, hello world, run server.listen, looks very, very familiar. Now, if I run that in this little file right here, I'm going to stop the previous app. I'm going to get out, go into 05, and run node server.js. It's going to be running. Now, if I want to run the client, I want to get information from this server through TCP, it's going to be a little bit different. And this is going to introduce this concept called event emitters. It's a node concept. And what you'll notice is that things here are a little bit different. For one, you're creating a new socket as opposed to a server. You're telling it to connect to a specific port and host. And what's interesting here is that there's this new function that you probably haven't seen before called on. And what this function is going to do is it's going to say, hey, whenever I get a data event, execute this function. So on data, run this callback. Okay, and all this callback is going to do is just going to log whatever it was received and then close the client. So if I go back into my command prompt, so here's my server. I'm going to open up my client. I'm just going to move this on the side a little bit so you can see both of them side by side. If I go into 05, and you might not be able to see it on the screen, but here it is. I'm going to run node client. And there we have it. So the server reported a connection from localhost, and the client received data. Now, you'll see this is very different from what we've done with the callback, and this is event emitters.
Cool. And I think like for some of those more complex things like event emitters, that kind of thing, we have a lot of stuff that's listed in our slides, and some extra resources in terms of, where to go with those kind of things. Important concept to know.
That's right.
I think, quickly what we should try to go through is the Node Package Manager. And there's been a couple of really great questions in the chat, which I'll also try to, filter through maybe in the next module. Some really, really simple and awesome questions that are being asked. Some simple, some definitely not, trust me. So some of them like, whoa, yeah, you're doing something serious there. So Node Package Manager. Let's quickly talk about NPM and Node Package Manager is, a lot of languages have their own kind of versions of this if you want to think of it that way, whatever it may be. So NPM, official Node Package Manager for Node, right?
Yeah, it's bundle install automatically with your environment. Very simple to use. NPM install the package name. If you add -- save, it will actually install it to package.json, which is a file in your folder that will describe the dependencies that are available to you that are needed for this module. So here's an example of package.json, Node 101, MVA presentation code. You can see that you can describe the module that you're in and say who the author is, say what's the main file. And what's really cool about package.json is that you can also list the dependencies that this module needs.
Yep.
And then whenever you run npm install, without any package name, it will just take a look at this package.json and install everything.
Yeah, it's just like the requirements for your project. And the beauty of it is like you can say, I need this version of this library.
That's right.
Often you need to do those kind of things.
Yeah, and there's lots of great modules that are on NPM. And here's a list of some of the most depended ones.
Underscore, my number one favorite. I love underscore.
If you're a front-end dev and you love underscore, you can also use underscore on the back end as well. So you can see that you've got that code portability between the front end and back end with JavaScript.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch, whether it be async, request, popular NPM modules. Once again, anytime you're doing anything with APIs, there's always modules for that. If you're doing anything that's like utility-based, there's always modules for that. So always just take a look for what there may be before you go ahead and kind of try to write your own. We talked a little bit about how, the package.json, which to me is kind of like a requirement listing, how it works. And it's the idea of just, that whole listing of these modules that this project's going to need. And, if you go into that project and you use NPM, now it's very common when you first start working with Node, and I still do it, where it's like I'll be Node NPM and I'll be like trying to run something with NPM, and that's not its job. That's Node's job. But if you go in and you say, okay, I'm going to install what's in this folder or the dependencies, it will create basically a local kind of Node modules folder and dump everything in there. So it keeps that kind of nice environment that's not polluting everything everywhere. In that kind of scenario. You can also install modules if you want globally. You might constantly use something across the board and assume that other people are as well, whatever it may be. So you can also, install those things globally if you want, which is, the same in a lot of other languages. If you're working in Python, similar kind of idea. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, and what's really cool, that one of my favorite things about having all your Node modules installed to your local folder is that I can just copy that whole folder and all my dependencies will come with me. That's just one of the things that I love about this structure.
So I think we're going to leave you with this module with some resources that are listed on this slide. Once again, we've listed the GitHub repo, GitHub repo. I'm going to pronounce it like that from now on. And we've also just gone through and some resources on Node. we've gone through the basics, so you can take some of these like for further reading. Definitely read up on things like asynchronous programming, read up a little bit on promises, get that kind of sense of what's going on and how those things work. In our next module, what we're going to do is we're going to cover just an intro to the Express framework and, just getting your very first Express app running, that kind of scenario, and, kind of take you a little bit further down the road of Node. So we're going to take a short break and we'll see you guys in 10 minutes.